As said, my name is Michele Garatola. I'm working for the Commission already since many years. And today, first of all, I would like to thank the organizer for having invited me to this workshop and for giving me the possibility to present what is happening here in Europe when it comes to a circular economy and, of course, industrial symbiosis, which is an important application of that. And today I will focus my short presentation on the first part to give you a little bit of the political context, because this is important to understand what is happening from the policy perspective, because that will have an impact in the years to come on the on what is happening from the market perspective here in Europe, also to some extent from the trade point of view, but also because many of the things that that happens in Europe or that Europe develops as a concept, we have seen in the past that then become mainstreams also in other regions of the world. So if you move to the next slide, please. There, I want to basically recall something that already my colleague Paola Bellabona has mentioned. There's been in 2019 a very important policy act, the European Green Deal, that basically is driving all our efforts in terms of industrial policy and policy related to environmental issue. And this is very important because we never had such an important shift of priorities in terms of European policies. Today, and we will see also soon when I mention also the impact of COVID, all the mainstream decisions related to digitalization, related to industrial policies, but also related to how the money will be spent in research and other activities, everything has to pass through the test of, is it green? Is it going to improve sustainability? Is it going to be circular economy efficient? So these keywords, the climate neutrality, circular economy, and the aim to go towards zero pollution are really at the basis of all our policy actions. And that is important because that becomes also an indicator, for example, for investment, where to focus the private money and the public money for investment. Next slide, please. We want, through policies that we are now preparing, we want to promote lead markets for products that have low carbon content and that they are contributing to our environmental and social objectives. This is again an important shift in mindset, because we are moving from a situation where basically all products were kind of acceptable to the market unless they were really bad performing, and then there were some kind of incentives for the best performing products, incentives in terms of public procurement or labeling or things like that. Now, with time, the idea is that only the products that can prove that they are circular, sustainable, only those products will be allowed to enter the European market. Of course, it's not something that is going to happen from one day to the other, but it's an important shift in terms of mindset. Next slide, please. So in order to prepare the ground for that, we announced that next year we will adopt a new product policy framework that we called Sustainable Product Policy Initiative. And starting from there and from other initiatives that we are developing, you will start seeing this new concept implemented in Europe, and want also to use this new mindset not only to increase our own resource security, so from a strategic autonomy viewpoint, but we want also more and more to feed in this concept into our trade policies and to our development policies, because many of these issues, and we could draw a parallel with COVID, but many of these issues are not local issues. If you think, for example, to climate change, every single molecule of CO2 emitted in any part of the world has a direct impact on European citizens as well. So it is also our responsibility not only to do the best we can to reduce the emissions in Europe, but also to try to set up policies that directly or indirectly contribute to reduce climate change also happening and taking place in other parts of the world. Next slide, please. Can you move to the next one? Yes. This is very shortly to recall what the circular economy is. We have a new circular economy action plan that has been adopted this year in March, and this one is more and more focused at the whole life cycle. So it's not only about waste, but it also look at designing products and services in a better way. It looks at how to promote financial markets supporting activities that are really sustainable. It looks at, as I say, the global level playing field in terms of trade policies. It look at research. It look at the social component, because there is always the risk that by trying to push this advanced sustainability concept, then we risk to exacerbate the differences between people that have low income or high income, or people who have other forms of disadvantages. But we don't want to do that, and that is why there is a special attention to the social component of our sustainability agenda. And then, of course, there is all the work related to monitoring, because in order to have sound policies, you need to be aware of the impacts that you are having, and so that you can steer changes in the right direction. Next slide, please. As I said, the new Sustainable Product Policy Initiative will be one of the cornerstone or the flagship of this commission led by Ursula von der Leyen. As I said, we want progressively that sustainability becomes the norm of our products. We are going to change the main policy instruments that today we have, which is the Eco-Design Directive, that until today was only focusing on energy using and energy-related products. We want to extend the scope of this legislation to all sorts of products. Basically, this is a legislation, for those of you that are not aware, that defines certain minimum requirements that products have to have in order to enter the European market, and is equally applicable to products produced in Europe and products produced outside Europe. Next slide, please. How we want to change this directive? Basically, we want not only to enlarge the scope to other typology of products, but we want also to bring in a more consistent way other elements of sustainability. We want to bring more the right to, for example, right to repair for consumers, issues related to durability, to reusability. We want to, when it makes sense, to introduce a mandatory recycled content for some material in some products. We want to have always information related to the environmental footprint and the social footprint of products along the entire value chain. And another major element of difference is that all this information, we want to have it available in an electronic format, in a digital format. So there is the ambition to digitalize all the different value chains, and for that we are creating some digital space where all this information will be available both to the public but also to national authorities. We will probably start focusing on some key sectors for this new policy initiative, and the key sectors that we will start from will be probably electronics, information communication technologies, textiles, furniture, and then some materials like steel, cement, and chemicals. But that does not mean that we will not also look beyond that. There is still that possibility. For example, you don't see here food, because food will be tackled in a similar way by another initiative that is called Farm to Fork. Next slide, please. This slide, I will not invest too much time, but it will stay available for you to look into that afterwards. It is just to try to explain why we have taken this decision. Basically, we see a number of problems at European level, which probably to some extent also can be applicable to other countries. There is the problem that the environmental externalities are not internalized. So still today polluting costs not much compared to the damages that it does. So you cannot internalize that into the market price mechanisms. Sustainability until now has only been partly addressed. There is a lot of focus on climate change, rightly so, but there are other issues that are equally important or that will become more and more important depending on the specific circumstances. There is often information that is provided to consumer is misleading. At least in Europe, we are experiencing a very high rate of misleading information, misleading environmental information. And the legislation does not really allow us to prosecute those who provide this wrong information. And then there is this issue of the need to have information along the entire value chain. And last but not least, there is evidence that all the voluntary approaches that we have been using in the last 20, 30 years were very good to bring in environmental consciousness, environmental political dimension, but there are limits to what a voluntary approach can have and can deliver. So now there is a reflection of kind of balancing more the use of voluntary approaches with the use of mandatory approaches. Next slide, please. I mean, I don't have to tell you that we are living in very strange times due to this COVID crisis. This slide is only to really pass you the message that when COVID will be over, we cannot go back to the situation we were before in terms of development models, but we need to focus more on the green developments. In Europe, it has been clearly decided that all the money that will go to help economies in different member states to recover from COVID will have to be focused on green technologies, on green developments, on circular economy, and only those investments that can assure the achievement of these green digital improvements, only those will receive funds. So this is just to say that probably there's never been a better time to invest in a circular economy and in industrial symbiosis. And I'm sure that will not only happen in Europe, but will happen also in other countries of the world. Next slide, please. Now, talking about business opportunities, because I know that there are a lot of companies. If you can move to the next slide. Yes, so talking about business opportunities, because I know that there are a lot of companies today with us. We see when we look at what the investment sectors is financing here in Europe, but also outside Europe, we see basically four different clusters of activities that I try to report in this slide. One is called the circular design models activities, then the optimal use models, the value recovery models, and the circular support models. So let's try to look into that and see what is covered in the different groups. Go to the next slide, please. So the circular design and production models, basically this includes all those activities that are focusing on the design of products. You know that most of the environmental impacts are determined at the design stage, about 80% of them. So it is really by designing the products differently that you can increase the resource efficiency, that you can bring in functionality related, for example, to modularity, to upgradability, to easy disassembly and repair. So there is a set of companies that are now entering the market into this area related to the development of new and sustainable materials, for example, or the use of compostable materials, or it is very important, the substitution or reduction of chemicals of high concern. For example, in Europe, this is a very top of the agenda, or the substitution of virgin materials with secondary raw materials and byproducts. For example, at least in Europe, there is a lot of talking about new taxes on plastics and on materials that do not have recycled content. So it is important for companies to develop new business model where they can make available technologies for producing these new products with, for example, higher recycled content, but also new materials that fulfill these new requirements. Next slide, please. The second area that we can look at is the circular use model. So we have seen the design, then there is the part related to the use. There, the interesting businesses that we are seeing popping up in Europe relate to the repairability of products. So how the little shops, more and more little shops that aim to repair products, extending their lifetime, the refurbishing for the building component, the remanufacturing of end-of-life products and their component. And this is important because these products before were discarded, so they would become waste. It would be an extra cost, but also a waste of resources. And now we see more and more these business models, especially local business models, integrated park and in industrial symbiosis situations that are developing this part of the business. The refurnishment part applies specifically to buildings and infrastructures. Then the other tendency that we are starting to see appear is what we call the servitization. So products that are not sold anymore as a product, but they are sold as a service, so that the producer of the product retains its property and so has all the interest, for example, in extending its life, but it has also all the interest to recover the materials that are often precious material that are in the products. That could be applicable or is applicable, for example, for mobile phones. But another area where we are seeing that model developed more and more is, for example, for electric cars, where the battery has often 30-40% of the value of the entire car is in the battery. So it is in the interest of the battery producer that they keep the property of the battery at the end of life, so that they can recover the materials or repurpose that, for example, for energy storage systems. Another interesting area in the circular use is related to the rehabilitation of degraded land. So remediation activities related to brown sites. Next slide, please. The third area is the circular recovery models. This is probably the most developed because it stems from the waste management. So here it's all about recovering materials from waste. And the strategic part and the key essential component here is the reverse logistic. So it is, in order to make this profitable, it is important that there is a very efficient network able to bring back the materials where they can be reprocessed. And that is important, especially that the logistics is developed in a way that you can optimize distances and flows of materials. And the same concept can be also applied to, for example, the reuse and recycling of wastewater. If we move to the next slide, we can have a look at the last of the four business opportunities, and this is in the area of circular support. So this is all the area related to the development of digital tools to support these activities, like to support reverse logistics and similars, the virtual marketplace for secondary raw materials, and all the activities related to the digitalization of supply chain, the product passport and tracing facilities, and all the consulting activities and the advisory activities that will be needed to support companies in these new endeavors. There is a lot of capacity building which is needed, and we are also supporting that, but we see huge opportunities for business there. I think this was my last slide, but you changed it. Yes, that was the last slide. So I would like to thank again the organizers for having given me the possibility to present.
So for the next 20 to 30 minutes, myself and Veronica are going to take the lead and talk about industrial symbiosis in more depth after the very nice introduction on circular economy by Michele. So we are going to be very briefly. So moving along, this slide I think has been covered from the previous speakers. So the context here is that In Europe, we have a circular economy action plan described very well by Michele, and the European Green Deal, both of which are operating obviously in alignment with the sustainable goals, sustainable development goals. Industrial symbiosis obviously is related more with the industrial aspects of these goals, although it obviously touches on the clean energy aspects and on the sustainable citizen communities aspects. And maybe we can discuss about this later on in the presentation. Again, most of this has been covered by previous speakers, but I just want to highlight that the circular economy in general presents a significant business opportunity as well as a business threat. So the idea here is that, as Michele described earlier, there is a significant transition ongoing on, for example, the type of products that will be acceptable in the European Union, which will obviously be an opportunity valued by Accenture in 2015 at approximately 4.5 trillion globally. But this will also bring threats to companies and businesses that cannot adapt to these changes. And the idea here is that early adopters will have the competitive advantage when these changes start to take effect in a more radical manner. So the core strategies of the circular economy have been described very well earlier. What I would like to draw the attention is in the figures here, where you kind of see along the value chain where industrial symbiosis sits, more or less. So we're not talking about design of process, and we're not talking also about end of life of products, of consumer products. We are sitting more or less at the manufacturing stage before products arrive to the final consumer. And we're looking at that stage of the value chain. What exactly, however, are we talking about? There are plenty of definitions in the literature and in practice of industrial symbiosis, and I would like to offer my own definition, which, by the way, I change every time I provide a presentation, but I think the gist is the same. So the important thing to notice is that industrial symbiosis is not some kind of engineering or a technical concept. It's actually a business-to-business commercial strategy, which consists of the commercialization or commodification, or anyway, businesses engaging in commercial transactions based on their non-products and other excess resources. So maybe non-products is a bizarre term, but I want to encompass with this term anything ranging from waste, which by definition is never sold to the market, to byproducts, which sometimes is sold to the market, to byproduct markets, but also to other non-products, like, for example, other excess resources, like, for example, utilities, storage space, and so on. Some key terms and concepts that you will stumble upon when you start looking at industrial symbiosis, just to have a common vocabulary when we are discussing here. One concept is the synergy concept. So synergy is basically the commercial transaction or the sharing of a single instance of such a non-product, byproduct, waste, or other resource between industries. When you have lots of synergies taking place between a certain amount of industries, 10, 12, 100, 200, depending, you have a symbiotic network. So you have a network of exchanges of such resources or non-products. When you have the characteristic of these industries being co-located, but not simply co-located in the sense of being close to each other, but also governed somehow by the same set of rules or the same entity, you have an eco-industrial park. So you have an industrial park that engages systematically in industrial symbiosis and other types of sustainable practices, and therefore forms an eco-industrial park. And then in industrial symbiosis, we often use the phrase facilitator to refer to third parties. So entities not directly participating in the exchange of the specific resource, but intermediate between the companies and other stakeholders and help identify and materialize industrial symbiosis opportunities. And finally, we have key enabling technologies, which refers basically to the technologies that address technical aspects, such as, for example, any type of processing or treatment required for the waste or byproducts to become useful. Or they address business aspects, and we are referring here mostly to digital tools that help with opportunity identification, evaluation, and matchmaking. And in the right, I have some diagrams to show you how this is translated to practice. So especially in the lower right, you can see that industrial symbiosis is basically a concept that is a little bit wider. So it encompasses direct transactions between companies. So the selling of waste without or with very little processing, but it can also encompass other strategies like refurbishment and recycling if there is more treatment required. So to continue, we have several typologies of industrial symbiosis, and this depends on the type of thing that is being exchanged or traded. It refers, for example, to waste and byproducts, as I said before. So this can be energy or materials or water, for example. We have utility and infrastructure sharing. So any utility and infrastructure like grids, for example, heat grids or networks, and water pipelines and wastewater treatment as well, that may be part of the symbiosis. And then also sometimes the joint provision of services is included here, which can mean transportation for the staff members and catering and so on. And you see, as I go from the top to the bottom, we are approaching more and more to the concept of industrial park. When we're talking about waste and byproduct synergies, we can, so waste synergies, we can distinguish also between direct synergies, as I mentioned before, which is basically when you have only things like packaging and logistics required for the product to become valuable for another industry, for the byproduct, I would say, or for the waste. Or you have indirect synergies when you need additional steps, additional treatment and processing steps, which may require additional facilities or a third processor entity participating for the symbiosis to take place. And again, you can see on the lower right, the distinction schematically as industry 1 and industry 2 want to engage in the symbiosis. On the upper part, you can see that they require additional processes, process 1, process 2, process N, for the valuable element to be, for example, extracted from the waste, or in some other case, you can have the byproduct only transported to industry 2, and this will be enough. Now, we've talked before about networks, that is many companies engaging between them in industrial symbiosis. And here again, we identify in theory and in practice, though, we have seen that there are three different main types of networks. The self-organized networks is where you don't have central organization, and you have an industrial symbiosis network emerging from bilateral interactions between companies. Oftentimes, each of the companies not having an awareness that in fact they participate in such a complicated network, in such a, let's call it a waste supply chain of a sort. In the second case, so this, for example, the self-organized network is oftentimes how an industrial symbiosis starts in a specific area or region. In the second case, we have the planned networks, where you have usually a governmental body planning the development, for example, of industrial parks from greenfields, as they call them, from day one, having in mind that industries with potential for symbiosis will be co-located and specific infrastructure will be put in place for this to work. this is often what is happening in China, for example. It's a typical example of this approach. But also other countries like Korea. As we can discuss later, this approach has been tried also in Europe and in the United States in the 90s without a lot of success. What has been successful in Europe is the so-called facilitated networks, where, as I mentioned before, a facilitator, a third party, which can be a private company, a consultancy, or a municipality, for example, or other association, industrial park manager, they take the role of facilitating the interactions between the companies. And they basically, as you see in the lower part of the slide, they help the companies and the symbiotic network to progress through the 5 stages of industrial symbiosis. So from the identification of opportunities to the assessment of their feasibility, the removal of barriers, be they technical, financial, or others, or organizational, and finally implementation and monitoring of the symbiotic exchange. So one final point for industrial symbiosis, also a point that has drawn a lot of attention and discussion, is the geographical scope. So maybe because industrial symbiosis was conceived in the context of eco-industrial parks in the late 80s, it has frequently been associated to co-located or industries in close proximity. What actually happens is that different types of resources participating in the industrial symbiosis will suggest different geographical scope. So, for example, the type of waste streams will, and its physical and chemical characteristics will influence that. As an example, you can see at the lower left, when you are dealing with steam and waste heat, by definition, there has to be some proximity, because beyond 50 or 60 kilometers distance, it's not feasible to transfer heat. Then, the second point is the value of the waste stream as well plays a role. So if the value is high per kilogram, for example, then transportation over long distances becomes an option. So that's why, for example, you will see at the lower left that low volume, high value resources like cobalt and other valuable and scarce metals have international scope. They can travel as much as 3,000 kilometers, for example. And finally, the geographical distribution of the resource recovery facilities is also a factor to be taken into consideration. In general, you see that things like steam and waste heat will remain local. You can see at the figure at the lower left that at the local level we have things like energy, cold and heat, combined heat and power plants, steam, demolition and construction waste as well, and food. They usually remain at the local waste for the local level for the aforementioned regions. At the regional level, you have, for example, common metals such as steel and aluminium. At the national and international level, you have critical materials, critical metals, and so on. Moving on, as I said before, industrial density is a factor. Just to highlight a certain point here. However, we see that 75% of synergies, and that percentage obviously is an order of magnitude, but around that 3/4 of synergies do take place within a radius of 120 kilometers. Although some of them can reach, as I said before, up to 3,000 kilometers. So that's something to keep in mind. Keeping that in mind, we see here that if you look at the maps of Europe, for example, and at what you see on the right hand is a map of industrial, of the density of industrial activity, the density, to be precise, of environmentally impactful industries in Europe. And on the left-hand side, you see a map of eco-industrial parks in Europe. And you can see that there is a certain degree of overlap. So in the Benelux area, for example, where you have the highest density of industrial activity is where you have most of the eco-industrial parks. And the same is the case for the Barcelona area in Spain, for example. And the same is the case for North Italy and so on. So it is definitely a factor. And you can see on the table at the bottom that out of several eco-industrial parks surveyed by Eco-Innovera for this map to be produced, about 50% employ industrial symbiosis together with other types of strategies for sustainability in their premises. So definitely there is an association here between industrial parks and close proximity and industrial symbiosis, but it's not an absolute association. We will see later that there has been examples of symbiosis over greater scales. This is, I will not go in detail because I think Veronica will have some examples, but this is just to show you an example of such an eco-industrial park. It's a typical example. It's located in Sweden. And you can see that all the arrows here indicate waste exchanges. So apart from the main products that the companies produce in this park, there is a very high number of waste exchanges. And actually, to be honest, this is not exactly an industrial park because as you see here, you have exchanges with the municipality as well. So this is maybe, you would call it an eco-region or eco-city. It's a wider area. But it's a very good example, and you can see that this has been done in practice. This park has been operating for more than 20 years now. And the exchanges have been increasing through time. Very quickly, historical development, at least in Europe, but also globally. So industrial symbiosis basically emerged as a term and as a concept in the late 80s. And it emerged by the top management of General Motors at the time. Fros and Galopoulos published a paper that discussed the industrial ecosystem and how the effluents of one process must be the raw materials for another. In the same year, by accident in Denmark, it was uncovered that there was an industrial symbiosis network, so that many companies in Kalundborg Industrial Park were engaging indeed in exchanges of waste material, but they did not know it. They were not aware themselves of the wider network in which they were participating. This was uncovered by a group of students, and interestingly, a pharmacist and her husband termed this industrial symbiosis, and the term stuck afterwards. You can see in the diagram here that in 2015 there were 30 or 29 exchanges, including wastewater, waste energy, and other byproducts between 10 sites in this industrial park. And you can see here an indication of also the benefits in terms of water saved and annual savings across the firms and CO2 savings. So you can see from this that this is something to be desired. What happened later in the 90s, and now we will see that another example. So the whole concept of industrial ecology, under which industrial symbiosis is classified, started to take off. In USA and Europe, there were many attempts to establish replicas of Kalundborg, basically. To be honest, many of these attempts failed. There was still little understanding of how these things worked, and maybe there was also not enough incentive from the policy point of view. However, for about a decade, in 2010, a national industrial symbiosis program was launched in the UK, which was very successful. So with an investment of about 100 million over 10 years, it managed to, and a nationwide applicability, it managed to gather more than 12,000 members and achieve significant impact in terms of, again, both financial, so about 2.6 billion if you put together cost savings and additional sales, 10,000 jobs generated, and 42 million tons of CO2 reduction, just to give you some examples. The scope was national, but there were 12 teams operating on a regional level all across the UK. Despite the success, the program was stopped in 2013 when public funding for the program was seized due to budget cuts owed to the financial crisis. However, after that point, mainland Europe took the lead, and between 2012 and 2020, industrial symbiosis found itself at the core of many European policies, including the Circular Economy Action Plan and other resource efficiency policies. And it also started receiving significant funding, again in the context of investments towards circular economy. As an indication, the EU investment in industrial symbiosis for the past 7 years has been more than 200 million euros. And this is excluding national programs, which have also contributed significantly. There are more than 100 projects and programs across Europe operating in this time period on industrial symbiosis. And also the number of eco-industrial parks have increased to 116, with Germany, France, and Spain leading in terms of numbers. While also we have a global mapping of industrial parks, which are estimated to be around 300 around the world, with China and the USA following European countries in number of parks. The question is why. I think from the presentation so far, it has become more or less clear. So you see on the left that the main reasons here is the minimization of environmental impact. So you reduce the resources extracted because you're using waste to substitute raw material. Also reducing pollution and waste disposal in this way. The value added per unit of production of resource, is increased as well. Again, through the avoidance of waste disposal costs and creating new revenues by basically selling waste. Also, the supply side resilience is increased because waste tends to cost less than virgin material. And also, this contributes to diversifying the supply chain and lowering risks. Also, it contributes to making the supply chain more local. And finally, we have an increase of economic activity, again, per unit of resource in the region where this is happening. So this translates to new jobs and also generate local investments from the companies participating in the symbiosis. You can see this in a recent survey of participants in industrial symbiosis conducted in 2019, where these types of new revenue, for example, reduction of waste, decrease of company costs from buying resources, and new partnerships looking at supply chain have been highlighted by businesses as the most important aspects. So just to wrap this up, and please do not go through all these numbers. This is just some recent estimates of the potential for industrial symbiosis in Europe. And you can see on the left-hand side, total investment in the European Union is estimated as the potential, right? Not what is happening today, is estimated at 70 billion euros. And on a different independent study on the right, you can see that, again, the potential savings from landfill diversion is around 70 billion euros, and the potential for additional sales between 7 and 13 billion euros. So different studies conducted in Europe agree that the potential of symbiosis, at least in economic terms, is very significant. And you can see in the left-hand side that also in terms of, for example, reduction of CO2 emissions, the potential is in the order of magnitude of hundreds of billions of CO2 equivalent units. So this, I think, covers both the environmental and the economic aspects. And if you see at the jobs estimated on the upper left, we're looking at possibly between 200,000 and 1 million jobs in Europe as well. So there has been some work recently. We didn't have such numbers a while ago. Very quickly, just to show you how this looks like in terms of actual materials. So we see, for example, that more than 50% of the pie here of the materials examined from Scalar project having potential for symbiosis is in construction and demolition waste. However, notice that the value of this is approximately 1 billion euros. And if you compare it, for example, with the plastics, which is much less in quantity, but almost double in value. It's 2.4 billion euros. So you see here a pie chart based on quantities, but the values differ. And obviously the environmental impact differs as well. But this is an example. So you see that construction and demolition waste, electronic waste, food waste, plastics, used oils. Used oils, for example, is only a very tiny part in terms of quantity, but has significant potential, economic potential. And wood are important types of waste to be considered. I think I will go very quickly here. So barriers. There are several barriers for industrial symbiosis. From a technical point of view, obviously, when there is no technology in place to conduct symbiosis, there are problems. But I think, as you will see on the right, the most important barriers are basically lack of time, high risk and uncertainty for the feasibility part, usually, of the symbiosis, high transaction costs, also low know-how. You find that companies and other stakeholders often are not familiar with the concept, and they struggle to do the corresponding tasks to bring symbiosis in fruition. So these are some of the barriers that exist, and the facilitators typically help companies and other authorities to overcome these barriers. I have here a couple of projects, and I will go very quickly, that we have conducted in Europe in the past 4 years.
Last minute.
So this is the Serbox project. It took 4 years until August 2019 with a budget of 6 million. I will just jump. The main purpose was to develop an ICT tool to support symbiosis, but also we conducted the actual facilitation during the project with 26 active synergies at the end of the project. And to skip the numbers, I will just say that the leverage factor of the project was 11 euros generated for every euro invested by the European Commission. Similarly, we have a project ongoing, started last month. This time it's about a third in size, 2 million, and it's developing an incubator to support energy symbiosis, so only for energy sources. And again, to jump a lot of numbers, the expected leverage factor is 5 to 1 in a period of 6 years.
Bueno, pues para que sepan un poco por qué estoy hablando de esto, lo que hacemos nosotros precisamente es hacer de facilitadores de los proyectos de simbiosis industrial, sobre todo territoriales, viéndolos en sistema, ¿no? Siempre pensamos que si en un bosque no existen residuos, porque todo fluye y todo se regenera, y toda la energía viene del sol y todo es colaborativo, ¿por qué no hacemos que nuestras industrias pues colaboren de forma que formen también un ecosistema, en este caso industrial, ¿no? Bueno, pues con este concepto hemos desarrollado varios proyectos territoriales, siempre alrededor o básicamente alrededor del área metropolitana de Barcelona, que es donde se concentra buena parte de la industria, no solo en Cataluña, sino también en España, ¿no? Hay unos cinturones industriales donde está casi toda la industria del país, ¿no? Y quería empezar con el piloto. O sea, el proyecto de Manresa en simbiosis fue el primero que pusimos en marcha en España y lo consideramos piloto porque tiene mucho de cultural las barreras que hay para implementar economía circular entre empresas, ¿no? Estamos acostumbrados a hacer las cosas de una manera y que ahora nos vengan a decir que tenemos que colaborar con el vecino, con el proveedor, con el cliente, cambiando la forma que tenemos de producir y de relacionarnos con el mercado, pues cuesta bastante, ¿no? Entonces, las herramientas que existen de los proyectos europeos en general siempre han sido, los ejemplos que has visto, que habéis visto, que ha explicado Yorgo, son proyectos del norte de Europa, ¿no? Entonces, en el sur de Europa hay otro tipo de cultura en la que la colaboración no está tan de la mano, o la colaboración para hacer otras cosas, no para negocios de este tipo, ¿no? Entonces, quisimos probar una nueva metodología con este proyecto, ¿no? Es un proyecto que financió aquí el gobierno catalán a través de la Agencia de Residuos y que participó el municipio de Manresa, que es un ayuntamiento que está a unos 60-70 kilómetros de Barcelona, y la que colaborara, en la que colaboraba muy estrechamente el parque industrial de la ciudad. Los empresarios estaban en una asociación y veían con interés el probar una nueva manera de relacionarse entre ellos, aparte de las típicas que tenían hasta ese momento, que era compartir las instalaciones comunes, la iluminación, que si la recogida de limpieza de calles, la seguridad. A esto se le añadía esta nueva oportunidad, que era probar nuevas formas de hacer negocios entre ellos, compartiendo todos aquellos recursos sobrantes, que en teoría estaban pagando dinero para deshacerse. Al final, pues también tenemos mapas de ecosistemas industriales, como el que podía ser de Norrköping en Suecia. Bueno, pues aquí veis una serie de relaciones entre empresas. Las que participaban, como en este parque industrial, habían inicialmente unas 180 empresas, que luego se fue extendiendo hacia toda la comarca y vendrían a ser unas 500, 600 empresas entrando, compartiendo en simbiosis. Y ahora os voy a explicar algunos casos. Bueno, estos son datos, es decir, es muy importante en todos los proyectos, como ha dicho Yorgos, poner datos, no impacto, porque para saber de dónde estamos, este número que ha dicho de por cada euro invertido, cuánto es el potencial de reversión, es importante no solo para que las administraciones públicas y las asociaciones empresariales vean el potencial, sino también para animar a las empresas. Estamos hablando de hacer negocio. Si no es negocio, no se va a hacer. Con lo cual, lo que hay que buscar es la manera que esa transformación o ese cambio de modelo, esa utilización diferente del residuo, para que sea una realidad, una viabilidad, que hay que cambiar para que sea negocio. Bueno, estos son números que ya los veréis, ¿no? Es decir, que esto simplemente en el primer año no son proyectos muy grandes, pero tienen su impacto, ¿no? El primer año empezaron con 50 personas, 28 empresas, se identificaron 8 sinergias, bueno, en fin, y una serie de datos de beneficios que interesó a las empresas y al territorio para seguir adelante. Por poneros un ejemplo, ¿vale? Hay algunas sinergias que son muy impactantes en cuanto a cantidades y otras que no lo son tanto, pero ayudan mucho a que se puedan implementar porque son fáciles y porque son muy visuales. Estas de aquí eran 2 empresas que estaban una tocando con la otra, son súper vecinas. El de señor fabrican trajes a medida. Y para ello tenían unos patronajes hechos con cartón, con una fina lámina de plástico, que es la fotografía de aquí a la izquierda, ¿vale? Y generaban residuos cada vez que cortaban el tejido y los tenían que tirar, porque es que aunque sean materiales recuperables por separado, estaban enganchados y nadie se dedicaba a separarlos. La empresa de al lado, Fitaller, hacía productos de decoración, cogían tableros de madera, de DMs, de cartones y hacían cortes por láser para hacer las letras estas que se pintan y se decoran y para hacer tipos de manualidades, ¿vale? Y para llevarlos a las tiendas utilizaban protectores que compraban, normalmente eran polietileno expandido. Bueno, pues cuando se conocen, Fitaller deja de comprar el Porexpan y le coge el residuo, o sea, se va al contenedor y lo pone y embala el producto pues, con ese material. Es una pequeña cantidad, es verdad que esto no evita el residuo, es decir, que al final llega a ser un residuo, pero evita comprar un nuevo material adicional, que en este caso se evita. Este otro ejemplo consiste en, hay una empresa que fabrica grandes instalaciones hechas con elementos de polietileno, tuberías, placas y tal, para hacer tratamientos de aires en las industrias. Son instalaciones grandes, utilizan grandes tuberías y grandes placas y las manipulan. Y en el manipulado tienen una serie de scraps, de pequeñas partículas que se estaban gestionando de buena manera. Es decir, se lo llevaba un gestor y seguro que llegaba a un tipo de recuperación bien, ¿no? Digna, ¿no? Pero es que en el mismo polígono había una empresa que extrusionaba plástico, ¿no? Y hacía barras. Technium, la empresa que genera el residuo, utiliza barras. Es una de las cosas que compra. Con lo cual, lo que se hizo fue ponerlas en contacto y decir, oye, mira, tu scrap se lo pasas a esta empresa, te extrusionará barras que luego tú comprarás. No solo estarán dentro del polígono, sino que generará también más negocio para los vecinos y encima tú podrás decir que estás cerrando ciclos y puedes también estar vendiendo a tus clientes una forma de trabajar diferente, ¿no? Y más sostenible. Bueno, pues luego otra cosa que me identificamos aquí, bueno, pues con un montón de plásticos de alta calidad se generan en pequeñísimas cantidades en muchas empresas. Eso hace que esos plásticos de alta calidad que tienen mercado no se recuperen y al final acaben en el banal, mezclados con todos y llevados a los rellenos sanitarios. Pues para poderlo recuperar lo que hicimos fue intentar ver la suma de todas ellas qué significaba. Y nos dimos cuenta es que ir con 2, 4, 20 toneladas no era nada, pero tener 600 toneladas al mes ya era muy interesante para atraer la inversión y el interés de posibles recuperadores que fueran capaces de tratar ese residuo allí mismo, incluso para proveerles de nuevo a las empresas o no, o para otros mercados, ¿vale? Bueno, y luego es importante en estos proyectos territoriales en los que no solo se mira el objetivo y el target siempre son las empresas que forman parte de un polígono, de un tema industrial. Pero no hay que olvidar que los parques industriales están dentro de un territorio en el que a lo mejor al lado hay una ciudad, que también hay un bosque cercano que genera biomasa, que hay un río que a lo mejor tiene agua y tiene potencial eléctrica, que hay granjas y tierras de cultivo. Todo esto forma parte del ecosistema y hay que tenerlo muy en cuenta a la hora de hacer este tipo de proyectos. O, si se tiene en cuenta, se tiene otro tipo de ventajas, ¿no? En este caso, el tema era social porque se recuperaban una serie de materiales que no eran residuos, sino que eran restos de producción, restos de empresas, ¿no? Las entradas y finales de las líneas textiles, restos de botones, las cajas de embalaje, que son materiales totalmente limpios, inocuos e interesantes. Bueno, pues se reunieron y se hacían pasar a las escuelas del territorio a buscar ahí los materiales para hacer las decoraciones de Navidad. En lugar de ir a la papelería de turno, pasaban por el scrap store del polígono a buscar estos materiales. Mientras pasaban, se les explicaba de dónde venía y por qué se hace, la importancia de no gastar. Y este tipo de entablación social es la que hace que el proyecto pues, realmente se enganche con los trabajadores, con y el resto de la sociedad en el cual este proyecto está trabajando, ¿no? Y luego, claro, está el proyecto el que le daba más rentabilidad económica a toda la iniciativa, que fue una red de calor en todo el polígono, aprovechando todas las múltiples fuentes que se identificaron, que se estaban desperdiciando, porque se intentaban tratar individualmente. Se pusieron en conjunto, se diseñó una red de calor y que bueno, ahora está en fase de acabar el proyecto y de implementarse. Ya tienen financiación, ya tienen los permisos realizados y el interés por parte de todas las empresas. Bueno, al final este proyecto acaba, el proyecto piloto, el de la financiación pública, acaba y hay que buscarle continuidad, porque lo que no pueden hacer este tipo de proyectos es acabar, porque esto es de largo recorrido. Estamos haciendo cambios culturales y el cambio cultural no se hace en 2, 3, 5 años, se tiene que hacer y hacer. Con lo cual, la continuidad en este proyecto vino de manos de la asociación, es decir, la asociación del parque industrial fue la que dijo que se tomaba y lideraba la continuidad del proyecto. Y entonces se creó esta primera oficina de simbiosis industrial a través de una asociación de empresarios en un parque industrial, ¿no? Al final siguen teniendo esta oficina, pero ha entrado a formar parte de la estrategia comarcal de toda la región en temas de economía circular, que incluye también los polígonos, ¿no? Con lo cual están dentro de un paraguas mayor, pero siguen haciéndolo desde la asociación. A partir de ese proyecto piloto de Manresa, bueno, pues muchos otros territorios vieron la oportunidad de utilizar este tipo de iniciativas para poder dirigirse a las empresas y darles un valor añadido. Ese valor añadido consistía en poder desarrollar todas las oportunidades que salen, pero que necesitan para ser viable, de la colaboración de más de una empresa. Cuando hay más de una empresa en una oportunidad de negocio, el proyecto es difícil de hacer, ¿vale? Normalmente se queda en cajón de alguien. ¿Por qué? Porque ¿para qué voy a hacer yo trabajo si te beneficia a ti? No es en mi actividad principal, tengo entre tiempo, desconfianza, y porque no estamos acostumbrados, este tipo de proyectos no se hacen. Los proyectos de simbiosis industrial tratan eso, ese espacio común, esos proyectos que necesitan de la colaboración de más de una empresa para poder ser económicamente viables y tienen sentido, pues trabajan en esto, de facilitando la colaboración en estas empresas. Bueno, pues muchos territorios, muchos municipios, muchas asociaciones empresariales empezaron a ver que podían actuar de facilitadores, haciendo este trabajo de nadie o de todos. Y uno de los primeros también en apuntarse fueron un corredor industrial muy potente que hay en el área metropolitana de Barcelona, que es de Sabadell, Barberà, Sant Quirze del Vallès. Hicieron un proyecto juntos, identificaron un montón de posibilidades de sinergias entre empresas, ¿no? Al final lo intentaron resumir en gráficos como este, que hay en todos los proyectos. Ahora os diré algunos ejemplos. Esto siempre va muy bien para visualizar las oportunidades. Esto unido con los números, con impacto, ¿vale? Y lo que eran muy buenos en este proyecto es en la comunicación. Uno de los problemas clave es que cuando se tratan de este tipo de cosas, de cambios de modelo, cambios de forma de producir, a veces el concepto de la comunicación falla porque no se habla de lo mismo. Bueno, cuesta mucho llegar a veces a que las empresas realmente vean la importancia que tiene participar y lo fácil que es en proyectos de este tipo así, ¿no? De este tipo territoriales que están facilitados además. Bueno, pues estas hicieron muy bien la comunicación destacando los casos que cada una de las empresas iban identificando, ¿no? Los explicaban con impactos, números, y con vídeos que grababan a los propios empresarios para diciendo, di tú las ventajas que has tenido, etcétera, ¿no? Fueron muy buenos en esto y este es un para copiar, para tener en cuenta. Bueno, y aquí una pequeña... había una empresa que hace aromas y cuando hacen aromas cogen residuos vegetales, básicamente, y es como hervir un té, ¿vale? Una infusión, y luego lo destilan. Bueno, pues lo que queda de la infusión sí que lo estaban gestionando bien porque lo llevaban a compostaje, pero se han planteado a través de allí un montón de alternativas. Por ejemplo, hay una estación de gestión de residuos municipales a medio kilómetro y que tiene una central de gestión anaerobia. Bueno, pues, y además necesitan mucho gas, con lo cual ahora están mirando de utilizar ese residuo orgánico, pasarlo a la digestión anaerobia y cogerse gas del que se produce con el proceso, ¿no? Total, están a medio kilómetro, 500 metros. Hacen muchas reuniones entre las empresas, desayunan juntos, tienen vídeos. Hay proyectos que son más rurales y tienen más residuos orgánicos, con lo cual temas de las digestiones anaerobias y los fertilizantes son más que otros que son químicas. Hay unos que son muy industriales. Este consorcio está promovido por un potente asociación industrial. Este es el polígono industrial de la Zona Franca, el primer polígono que hay dentro del puerto de Barcelona, con las grandes empresas químicas, y ahí tienen muchas sinergias entre las empresas químicas. Y aquí lo que se destaca de este proyecto es que los empresarios, los grandes directores, están involucrados directamente en el proyecto, cosa que facilita después el poder realizar con los técnicos de turno el desarrollo de las sinergias, ¿no? Cosas que se han detectado con este tipo de proyectos, bueno, pues compartir espacios. Había una empresa que era un diario que decía que tenía un montón de espacio libre a partir de las 9 de la mañana hasta las 8 de la tarde. y delante había una empresa de automóviles que necesitaba muchísimo zona de parking de camiones y tal. Bueno, pues se pusieron de acuerdo y empezaron a compartir. Empresas de zumos, que se utiliza el zumo para hacer pienso, para hacer la digestión anaerobia, para hacer platos y cosas de plastificarlos, ¿no? Hacer los bioplásticos a través de fibras, de este tipo de cosas. Esto está haciéndose dentro de este polígono en la zona franca, ¿no? Estos son otros tipos de proyectos de colaboración en restos de coches del sector automoción, que son restos de moquetas y de revestimientos de interior de automóviles que se trituran, se aglomeran y se hacen unas placas autoportantes que son acústicas, que se pueden colocar en las carreteras y autovías como sustitución de las de hormigón, ¿no? Y aquí también hay una colaboración entre varias empresas diferentes para hacer este tipo de producto, ¿no? Empresas alcoholeras y las empresas de vinos, que todas tienen los mismos tipos de residuos, lo normal de hacer con este tipo de las brisas y las madres de la fermentación del vino es hacer alcohol. Y hasta hace poco, cada gran compañía de vinos tenía sus alcoholeras asociadas. Todas pequeñitas, compitiendo en un mercado, que dices, mira, somos competidores en el mercado del vino, no de nuestros residuos. Al final se unen y hacen que las inversiones que necesitan las empresas alcoholeras para transformar ese residuo se hagan potentes y creen una nueva empresa gorda que pueda competir en mercado, que pueda gestionar bien su residuo y que dé dinero. Y esto es lo que hicieron estas empresas del sector del vino y del alcohol. Temas de orgánicos, de aguas, o sea, compartir recursos de depuradoras. ¿Para qué vas a hacerte una depuradora nueva si al mejor el vecino o el municipio está pensando hacer una y tú puedes involucrarte en todo este proceso para hacer un uso más eficiente de las infraestructuras? Pues, ¿por qué no? ¿No? Utilizar toda la cadena de valor de un material para poder gestionar mejor su residuo, como por ejemplo el de las etiquetas. Las etiquetas ya sabemos todos, o si no lo sabéis, ya os lo digo, es un material para ser residuo, ¿no? Pues todos son papeles siliconados, que si el residuo que queda de la etiqueta. Bueno, pues el fabricante, el que corta, el que imprime, el que usa, todos tienen el mismo tipo de residuo y cada uno diferentes. Bueno, si los pones todos juntos y creas una masa lo suficientemente interesante, hace viable el que se pueda plantear un negocio para poder valorizar este tipo de materiales, porque tecnología existe. Lo que falta es esta aglomeración del recurso para poder hacerlo, ¿no? Pues lo que hacemos es, para ponerlo en práctica, primero analizamos la información de muchas empresas, ¿vale? Cuando vemos que las empresas, la información se pueden... ¿Qué empresas se pueden ligar con qué a través de esta información? Y lo que lo hacemos es ponerlas a trabajar todos juntos, trabajar directamente con los empresarios, que son los que realmente conocen lo que se puede hacer con sus procesos, ¿no? Y como conclusión, decir que normalmente la colaboración en simbiosis no aparece de forma espontánea, siempre hace falta alguien que lo tire, es muy difícil que sea así. El facilitador es una figura muy interesante y muy necesaria en este tipo de proyectos, que son todos estos proyectos súper rentables. Lo que pasa es que necesitan un periodo de arranque hasta que se identifican las oportunidades y las empresas empiezan a trabajar para ello, que es importante tener datos, y es un tema que no estamos acostumbrados, tener datos para poder gestionar información, que tiene unos beneficios colaterales importantísimos para la sociedad y para el territorio, que es necesario las asociaciones empresariales para que trabajen entre ellas y para la administración, y que son las que dan confianza para hacer este tipo de relaciones, y en el fondo ahorra costes tanto a la administración como para las propias empresas. Y ya está, simplemente esto era lo que quería explicaros de mi caso, de mi experiencia en los casos que hemos estado haciendo de simbiosis industrial aquí por España.